One of the most famous events in the history of the Roman Empire is its division into two at the end of the 4th century, which marked the end of the ancient empire being governed as a single political entity, as it had been for much of its history. But given that so many emperors before this had headed the government all on their own, it raises the question, why was the empire permanently divided in 395 and why was there no attempt to reunite it? So before continuing, it's important to note that whilst the two halves of the empire were around separately, with separate courts, emperors and economies, nobody at the time considered them to be two distinct empires. This might sound strange, but this had happened in Rome before, notably under Diocletian or the sons of Constantine I. However, unlike those times, the empire would remain divided until the fall of Rome in the west and later Justinian's reconquests. Anyway, in the 4th century, Rome wasn't having the best time. Invasions across the frontiers, religious strife within the empire, civil war and conflict with Persia stretched the Roman state. The century sometimes saw single emperors who ruled the entirety of Rome's territory, with others having a deputy, a Caesar, whereas some co-ruled with another emperor in the east or the west, and sometimes those had deputies too. This system of whatever the strongest guy was able to force continued until the end of the century, when Theodosius I, aka Theodosius the Great, defeated his rivals and ruled all of Rome as its sole emperor. He declared his sons, Honorius and Arcadius, as his co-rulers in order to secure the succession in the west and the east. He died in 395, and thereafter no single person ruled over all of Rome until the fall of the west. So why? Well, for the most part there was no reason to. The western half of the empire was clearly the weaker of the two. And as such, the emperor in Constantinople was consistently seen as senior to the one in Ravenna. Rome was no longer the capital of the west at this point, by the way. Speaking of Rome, in 410 it was sacked by the Visigoths, which was just one more bad thing happening to the west, which was falling apart at this point. Now, the Eastern Emperor did interfere in the running of the western half at various points, appointing emperors and sending troops to repel invasions and retake some lost territory. But no Eastern Emperor made any claim to the running of the west, and there were two main reasons for this. The first was that none of them wanted to take over that mess. The western half of the empire had a weaker economy, more enemies both within and without, as well as much greater levels of corruption. The eastern emperors didn't want to see it fail, but running what looked like a lost cause would only weaken their own position. Emperors that kept losing battles often found themselves challenged, and so better to just supply men and hope for the best. The second reason was that the Eastern Empire had its own problems too. The Ostrogoths, the Huns and the Persians all continued to threaten Constantinople, and stabilising its own borders was the most important task. Running this half of the empire was difficult enough, and adding another half which had even greater issues was a no-go. This may seem callous, but ultimately this policy was successful, and after the fall of the West, the East remained and would even retake a great deal of territory under the reign of Justinian I. Although under his successors this wouldn't last. I hope you enjoyed this episode, with a special thanks to my patrons: James Bizanet, Sky Chappelle, Kartoitska, Yuduan Wang, Anthony Beckett, YN Hockey, AF Firefly, Alex Schwinn, Captain Psydog, Gustav Swan, The McWhopper, Robert C. Perkins, The Flying Deutschland, Cardinal Blue, Rod D. Martin, Marvin Cassow, Spencer Lightfoot, Shuenin, Maggie Patskowski, Mirza Ahmed, Copper Tone, Michael Holbert, Castle Bravo, Spinning Three Plates, Andy McGeehee, Arthur Hosey Jr., Danny Atanasio, Camoon Yoon, Winston Kaywood, Remco Heusman, Jim Stromberg, Beck to Bot, Charles I, and Lord Beak.